The crystal chandelier shattered into 1,000 pieces as the gunshot echoed through the marble lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel. Guests screamed and dove for cover behind velvet couches and marble pillars. In the chaos, nobody noticed the small woman in a gray housekeeping uniform moving with deadly precision through the smoke. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet maid who had been invisible to them for months. But to understand how Jessica Miller saved the life of a world leader and prevented an international crisis, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica Miller stepped out of the employee entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel at 5:47 a.m., the pre-dawn darkness of downtown Chicago wrapping around her like a familiar cloak. The service alley smelled of coffee grounds and industrial detergent, a sharp contrast to the opulent marble and gold that awaited guests in the main lobby just 50 feet away through reinforced doors. She adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag and walked toward the employee time clock with the same measured pace she'd maintained for the past 3 months. Her gray housekeeping uniform was identical to the dozen other early shift workers filtering through the service entrance. Polyester fabric that breathed poorly, sensible black shoes with thick rubber soles, and a name tag that read simply Jessica in block letters. The Grand Meridian wasn't just any hotel. Rising 43 stories above Michigan Avenue, it catered to heads of state, Fortune 500 CEOs, and international diplomats who demanded the kind of privacy and security that came with $1,000 per night suites. The lobby alone cost more to furnish than most people would earn in a lifetime, with Italian marble floors, Austrian crystal fixtures, and Persian rugs that required special insurance policies. Jessica had memorized every inch of the building's layout during her first week, though she'd never let on that her interest went beyond knowing which supply closets held extra towels. She knew the locations of every security camera, every emergency exit, every service elevator, and every blind spot in the surveillance network. She knew which guests tipped the housekeeping staff well and which ones barely acknowledged their existence. Most importantly, she knew that her unremarkable appearance and quiet demeanor made her virtually invisible to everyone who mattered. The employee locker room buzzed with the usual morning chatter as the housekeeping staff prepared for another day of catering to the ultra-wealthy. Maria Santos, a veteran housekeeper with 15 years at the Meridian, was complaining about a guest in the penthouse suite who demanded his sheets be changed 3 times in one day. "Acting like we don't have 30 other rooms to clean," she muttered, while stuffing her purse into a narrow metal locker. "Some people got too much money and not enough sense," agreed Janet Williams, pulling her graying hair back into a regulation hairnet. "That tech billionaire in 2847 left his bathroom looking like a hurricane hit it. Towels everywhere, water all over the marble. Took me 40 minutes just to make it presentable again." Jessica listened to the familiar complaints while organizing her cleaning cart with methodical precision. Toilet paper, fresh towels, vacuum bags, window cleaner, furniture polish, everything arranged in the exact order that would maximize efficiency during her rounds. The other housekeepers had stopped trying to make conversation with her weeks ago. She was polite but never volunteered personal information, ate lunch alone, and left immediately after her shift ended. What they didn't know was that Jessica Miller wasn't actually Jessica Miller. Her real name was classified, her background had been scrubbed from all public records, and her presence at the Grand Meridian was the result of intelligence gathered by people whose names appeared on no organizational charts. 3 months earlier, credible threats had been intercepted suggesting that the hotel would be targeted during an upcoming international economic summit. The exact nature of the threat remained unclear, but someone with significant resources was planning something that could destabilize global markets. Jessica had been inserted into the housekeeping staff using fabricated employment records and references that would pass any standard background check. Her cover story was simple: a quiet woman from Portland who'd moved to Chicago after a divorce, looking for steady work and a fresh start. She'd even manufactured a slight Oregon accent and studied local Portland landmarks in case anyone asked detailed questions about her past. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 12 years in special operations, conducting classified missions in some of the world's most dangerous locations, only to find herself scrubbing toilets and changing bedsheets. But this assignment required a different kind of skill set, the ability to observe without being observed, to blend into the background so completely that people forgot she existed while she gathered intelligence about potential security vulnerabilities. Her morning routine began on the 32nd floor, working methodically through the diplomat wing, where foreign ministers and trade representatives maintained semi-permanent residences during extended negotiations. Each room told a story through the items left behind: prescription bottles that revealed health conditions, phone chargers from specific countries, documents carelessly left on desks that contained fragments of sensitive information. Jessica never took photographs or made copies. Her memory had been trained to catalog details with photographic precision, and she'd developed techniques for remembering complex information without leaving any evidence of surveillance. A coffee stain on a particular document, the specific arrangement of toiletries in a bathroom, the number of suits hanging in a closet, all of it was automatically filed away. The guests rarely acknowledged her presence beyond perfunctory nods or brief instructions about towel preferences. To them, she was part of the hotel's infrastructure, as unremarkable as the wallpaper or the air conditioning vents. Minister Davidson from the British trade delegation had walked past her in the hallway while conducting a phone conversation about sensitive tariff negotiations, never considering that the woman pushing a cleaning cart might be listening to every word. Ambassador Kozlov from Russia had left classified diplomatic cables scattered across his desk while she cleaned his bathroom, apparently confident that the cleaning staff couldn't read Cyrillic text. He was wrong about that, among other things. The most challenging aspect of her cover wasn't maintaining the deception. It was accepting the casual disrespect that came with being perceived as invisible. During her real career, she'd commanded respect through demonstrated competence and earned authority. Now she endured condescending comments about her English skills, dismissive gestures when she asked about cleaning preferences, and the assumption that she was intellectually incapable of understanding conversations happening around her. Marcus Thompson, the head of hotel security, exemplified this attitude perfectly. A former police detective with 20 years of experience, he treated the housekeeping staff like potential thieves who needed constant supervision. Jessica had watched him conduct random inspections of employee belongings, scrutinize their movements through security footage, and interrogate them about any items that went missing from guest rooms. "Keep an eye on the new girl," she'd overheard him tell one of his subordinates during her second week. "Something about her doesn't add up. Too quiet, too careful, probably planning to steal something valuable when she thinks nobody's watching." If only he knew what she was actually watching for. Jessica's real concerns weren't about petty theft or employee misconduct. She was tracking patterns in guest behavior, identifying security vulnerabilities, and mapping the human networks that connected the hotel's most powerful visitors. The upcoming economic summit would bring together finance ministers, central bank governors, and trade representatives from 12 countries. The gathering would be informal, no official security protocols, no diplomatic immunity complexities, just influential people conducting sensitive business in an environment they considered safe. That assumption of safety was exactly what made them vulnerable. By 2 p.m., Jessica had completed her assigned rooms and was restocking supplies in the service corridor when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two men in expensive suits were standing near the service elevator, speaking in hushed tones about timeline adjustments and final preparations. Their voices carried the kind of tension that suggested they weren't discussing hotel accommodations or dinner reservations. She continued organizing cleaning supplies while listening intently. The fragments she caught were cryptic but ominous. Thursday evening, main event, no witnesses, and most disturbing of all, the package arrives tomorrow. Jessica had spent enough time in intelligence work to recognize the coded language of people planning violence. These weren't hotel guests discussing business deals or social events. They were operatives finalizing details for something that would happen in less than 48 hours. As the men walked away, she caught a glimpse of their faces and committed every detail to memory. One was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and a small scar above his left eyebrow. The other was shorter and stockier, with dark hair and the kind of watchful eyes that suggested military or law enforcement training. Both carried themselves with the controlled movements of people accustomed to violence. The pieces of a larger puzzle were finally starting to come together, and Jessica realized that her months of careful observation had been preparation for something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The economic summit wasn't just a target for disruption. It was going to be the scene of something much worse. But she was still just the invisible hotel maid, trusted by no one and suspected by everyone of being exactly what she appeared to be. The challenge now was figuring out how to prevent a catastrophe without blowing her cover or revealing capabilities that would raise questions she couldn't answer. The real test was about to begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning brought an unusual flurry of activity to the Grand Meridian's executive floors. Jessica noticed it immediately as she wheeled her cleaning cart off the service elevator on the 38th floor. Two men in expensive suits moving with purposeful urgency, hushed phone conversations in multiple languages, and the kind of tension that preceded major events. She began her rounds in the ambassador wing, starting with room 3847, where the German finance minister maintained a temporary residence during trade negotiations. Klaus Weber was a meticulous man who kept his personal items arranged with military precision, making it easy for Jessica to spot anything unusual. Today, his normally organized desk was cluttered with encrypted communication devices, satellite phones, and what appeared to be emergency evacuation protocols. The documents were written in German, but Jessica's linguistic training allowed her to understand the critical details. Weber's security detail had identified credible threats against multiple summit participants. Emergency extraction routes had been mapped through the hotel's service corridors. Most disturbing of all, there were references to intelligence suggesting an inside operation with potential hotel staff involvement. Jessica's blood ran cold. If the security team suspected internal threats, her own cover could be compromised through routine background investigations. Worse, the real conspirators might accelerate their timeline if they sense increased scrutiny from protective services. She photographically memorized the document layout, then moved to dust the furniture with practiced efficiency. Weber emerged from the bathroom in a silk robe, speaking rapidly into his phone in German. "The Americans are being too casual about this," he said, unaware that the woman cleaning his mirror understood every word. "3 separate intelligence agencies have confirmed suspicious activity, yet they insist the summit should proceed on schedule." Through the reflection in the mirror, Jessica watched Weber pace nervously near the window overlooking Michigan Avenue. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the jittery movements of someone who knew he was being hunted but couldn't identify the predator. "Tell the Chancellor I recommend postponing until we can guarantee proper security protocols," he continued. "This hotel may be compromised." Jessica finished cleaning the mirror and moved to the bedroom area where Weber's security briefing materials were scattered across the king-sized bed. Among the pages, she spotted photographs, surveillance images taken throughout the hotel showing various staff members, including several housekeepers. Her own face appeared in 3 different shots, captured by security cameras in locations she'd thought were blind spots. The caption beneath her photo read, "Jessica Miller, employment records verified, but behavioral patterns suggest possible intelligence training. Recommend enhanced surveillance." Her heart rate remained steady through years of conditioning, but internally, alarm bells were screaming. Hotel security had been watching her more closely than she'd realized. The challenge now was determining whether they suspected her true identity or simply viewed her as a potential security risk due to her careful, methodical behavior. Weber finished his phone call and noticed her presence for the first time. "You," he said in accented English, pointing directly at her. "How long have you been working in this room?" Jessica looked up from changing the bedsheets, adopting the slightly confused expression she'd perfected for these interactions. "I'm sorry, sir. I just started cleaning about 10 minutes ago. Is there something wrong with the service?" Weber studied her face intently, comparing it to something he couldn't quite place. After a moment, he shook his head dismissively. "Nothing. Just finish quickly and leave." Jessica nodded obediently and continued her work, but she could feel Weber's eyes tracking her movements. He'd definitely seen her photograph in the security briefing and was trying to determine if she posed a threat. The careful balance of her cover was beginning to crack under the weight of increased attention. As she moved through the remaining rooms on the floor, the pattern of heightened security became more apparent. Ambassador Liu from China had armed bodyguards posted outside his door, something that hadn't been present during her previous visits. The British trade representative had installed additional electronic countermeasures in his suite, evidenced by the small blinking devices attached to his phone lines and computer equipment. Most concerning was the change in staff behavior throughout the hotel. Marcus Thompson had tripled the security patrols, with guards now stationed at every service elevator and emergency stairwell. The housekeeping supervisor, Patricia Hayes, was conducting random inspections of cleaning carts and had implemented a buddy system requiring staff to work in pairs. "New policy from corporate," Patricia explained when Jessica expressed confusion about the partner assignments. "Someone upstairs is paranoid about hotel security. They want accountability for every employee movement during the summit week." Jessica was paired with Rosa Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the housekeeping staff, who took pride in knowing every gossip detail about the hotel's operations. While this complicated Jessica's surveillance activities, it also provided opportunities to gather intelligence through Rosa's extensive network of information sources. "Something big is happening," Rosa whispered as they cleaned the diplomat conference room on the 39th floor. "I heard Mr. Thompson talking to those government men in suits. They're worried about some kind of attack during the economic meetings." Jessica feigned mild interest while carefully positioning herself to eavesdrop on conversations in the adjoining security office. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thompson briefing his team about new protocols. "Every staff member gets background verification before they're allowed near the VIP floors," Thompson was saying. "I don't care if they've worked here for 20 years. Something doesn't feel right about this whole situation." One of his subordinates asked about specific concerns, and Thompson's response made Jessica's stomach drop. "Intel suggests the threat comes from someone with legitimate access to secure areas. Could be catering, maintenance, housekeeping, or even front desk. We're looking for someone who's been studying our security patterns." Another voice joined the conversation, someone Jessica recognized as Agent Bradley from the State Department security detail. "The suspicious employee profiles have been narrowed to 12 individuals. We'll be conducting discrete interviews starting this afternoon." Jessica knew she was almost certain on that list. The behavioral patterns that made her effective at intelligence gathering had also made her stand out to trained security professionals who were specifically looking for signs of covert activity. As she and Rosa finished cleaning the conference room, Jessica noticed something that sent chills down her spine. The room had been configured for a dinner meeting the following evening, with place cards indicating seating arrangements for the Economic Summit's final session. The positioning put the most high-value targets, including the Federal Reserve Chairman and the European Central Bank President, in perfect alignment with the large windows facing the adjacent office building. A sniper's paradise. Jessica memorized the seating chart while pretending to dust the table settings. If the assassination attempt was planned for tomorrow night's dinner, the killers would have clear sightlines from multiple angles. But that information was useless if she couldn't find a way to share it without compromising her cover. The afternoon brought the promised security interviews. One by one, hotel employees were called into temporary interrogation rooms set up in unused conference spaces. Jessica watched through security monitors as her colleagues emerged looking shaken and confused by the questioning. Mariah Santos came out first, her face flushed with indignation. They asked me about my family in Mexico, my finances, whether anyone had offered me money for information about hotel guests. Like I would betray the people who trust me with their privacy? Janet Williams was visibly upset after her session. 23 years I've worked here, and they're treating me like a criminal. Asked about my political beliefs, my opinions about foreign policy. What does that have to do with changing bed sheets? When Jessica's name was finally called, she entered the makeshift interrogation room with the same quiet demeanor she'd maintained throughout her employment. Agent Bradley sat behind a metal table with Thompson beside him, both studying her personnel file. "Jessica Miller," Bradley began, his tone professionally neutral. "Born in Portland, Oregon, divorced, no children, moved to Chicago 3 months ago and started working here immediately. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Jessica replied, adding a slight nervous tremor to her voice. Thompson leaned forward. "Your employment application indicates you have no previous hotel experience, yet your work performance has been exceptionally thorough. You seem to understand our security protocols better than employees who've been here for years." Jessica adopted a slightly confused expression. "I just try to do good work. My ex-husband always said I was too detail-oriented for my own good." Bradley consulted his notes. "Tell me about your previous employment in Portland." This was the moment Jessica had prepared for during months of cover development. She launched into her carefully crafted backstory about working as an administrative assistant for a small logistics company, complete with fabricated details about daily responsibilities and coworker relationships. Every element of the story was designed to explain her organizational skills and attention to detail without suggesting any security or intelligence background. The interview continued for 25 minutes, with both men probing for inconsistencies in her story. Jessica answered every question with the right balance of nervousness and honesty, occasionally asking if she was in some kind of trouble. Finally, Bradley closed the file. "We appreciate your cooperation, Ms. Miller. You can return to your duties." As Jessica left the room, she caught a glimpse of Thompson making a notation in her file. Whatever he'd written, it didn't look like a clearance approval. The day ended with Jessica more isolated than ever, under increased scrutiny from multiple security agencies while still needing to gather intelligence about an assassination plot scheduled to unfold in less than 18 hours. The careful balance she'd maintained for months was collapsing, and she still didn't know who she could trust with the information that might save lives. The clock was ticking, and Jessica Miller was running out of time to prevent a catastrophe that would reshape global politics forever. That evening, Jessica's world changed completely when she discovered she wasn't the only one operating under false pretenses at the Grand Meridian Hotel. The revelation came at 11:47 p.m., long after the hotel's public areas had emptied and most of the diplomatic security teams had settled into their overnight positions. Jessica had been conducting her nightly reconnaissance, moving through the service corridors to map the new security checkpoints and patrol routes. The increased surveillance made these movements infinitely more dangerous, but she needed to understand how the enhanced protocols might affect tomorrow's assassination attempt. She was photographing the revised security camera positions near the executive elevator bank when she heard footsteps approaching from the main corridor. Jessica quickly ducked into a maintenance closet, pulling the door almost shut while leaving a narrow gap to observe whoever was approaching. Two figures emerged from the shadows, Marcus Thompson and someone Jessica had never seen before. The stranger was a woman in her 40s with short-cropped auburn hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested military training. She wore dark clothing and carried what appeared to be specialized communication equipment. "The asset has been compromised," the woman said, in a voice that carried authority despite her low volume. "Our inside surveillance confirms the Miller identity is fabricated, but we can't determine her real affiliation or objectives." Thompson nodded grimly. "My gut told me something was wrong about her from day one. Too precise, too observant. She's definitely not some displaced housewife from Oregon. Jessica's blood ran cold. They knew her cover was blown, but more importantly, they were referring to someone as the asset, suggesting the existence of their own covert operative within the hotel. The auburn-haired woman consulted a tablet device. Phase 2 implementation begins at 0600 hours. The package arrived this afternoon and is secured in the designated location. Timeline remains unchanged despite the security complications. What about the Miller problem? Thompson asked. Eliminate if necessary, but only if she interferes directly with the operation. We can't afford to draw attention with premature action. The primary objective takes precedence over collateral concerns. Jessica watched them disappear around the corner toward the freight elevator, her mind racing with implications. Thompson wasn't just the head of hotel security. He was coordinating with outside operatives to facilitate the assassination. The package they referenced was almost certainly weapons or explosive devices that had been smuggled into the building. She waited 10 minutes before emerging from the closet, then began following their route through the service areas. Her special operations training included advanced surveillance techniques, but she had to be exceptionally careful given that Thompson knew the hotel's security systems better than anyone. The trail led to the hotel's sub-basement level, an area restricted to mechanical systems and long-term storage. Jessica had explored these areas during her first week, but hadn't found anything suspicious at the time. Now, with organized conspiracy confirmed, she needed to locate the mysterious package before morning. The sub-basement was a maze of concrete corridors lined with electrical conduits, water pipes, and ventilation ducts. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows that made navigation treacherous, and the ambient noise from mechanical systems provided cover for movement but also masked potential threats. Jessica found evidence of recent activity near the building's central air handling system. Fresh scuff marks on the concrete floor, displaced dust patterns on equipment housings, and most tellingly, a section of ductwork that had been recently opened and resealed. Using a small LED pen light, she examined the modified ductwork more closely. Someone had installed what appeared to be a sophisticated dispersal system connected to the hotel's main ventilation network. The device was compact but clearly designed to distribute something throughout the building's air supply. Chemical weapon. The realization hit Jessica like a physical blow. This wasn't just an assassination plot targeting specific individuals at tomorrow's dinner. It was a mass casualty attack designed to eliminate everyone in the hotel simultaneously. The diplomatic summit was providing cover for something far more devastating than anyone had imagined. She began photographically documenting the device's configuration, memorizing serial numbers, connection points, and timing mechanisms. The technical sophistication suggested state-level resources and engineering expertise. This wasn't the work of freelance terrorists or criminal organizations. A soft sound from the corridor made her freeze instantly. Footsteps were approaching, moving with the deliberate caution of someone conducting security rounds. Jessica killed the penlight and pressed herself against the shadows behind a massive water heater. The beam of a powerful flashlight swept through the mechanical room, probing corners and equipment alcoves with systematic precision. Jessica held her breath as the light passed just inches from her position, then moved on to examine the area where she'd been investigating the ventilation system. "Something's been disturbed here," a male voice said quietly. A second voice responded, Thompson's distinctive tone. "Run a full sweep. If someone's discovered the installation, we need to know immediately." Jessica realized she'd left subtle evidence of her investigation. Displaced dust, fingerprints on metal surfaces, possibly even footprints in areas where maintenance staff rarely ventured. Her heart rate remained controlled through conditioning, but she was calculating escape routes and engagement scenarios if the situation deteriorated. The flashlight beam continued its methodical search, while Thompson's radio crackled with static. "Control to Security Chief. Status report on basement sweep. Still in progress. Possible intrusion evidence discovered. Investigating." The other voice belonged to someone Jessica recognized, David Mitchell, one of the night shift security guards she'd observed during her months of reconnaissance. His presence confirmed that the conspiracy involved multiple hotel staff members, not just Thompson. "Check the access logs," Mitchell said. "See if any employee cards were used down here in the past 4 hours." Thompson consulted a handheld device. Nothing since 1800, when the HVAC technician finished the scheduled maintenance. Jessica knew that maintenance record was fabricated. She'd been monitoring the building's legitimate service schedules as part of her intelligence gathering. The HVAC technician was almost certainly the person who'd installed the chemical dispersal system. The two men continued searching for another 15 minutes before concluding that the disturbances were probably caused by routine building settling or small maintenance adjustments. As their footsteps faded toward the elevator, Jessica remained motionless for an additional 20 minutes to ensure they weren't conducting counter-surveillance. When she finally emerged from hiding, Jessica's priorities had completely shifted. The assassination plot was secondary to preventing a mass casualty chemical attack that could kill hundreds of innocent people, hotel guests, staff members, and diplomatic personnel alike. But she still had no one to trust with this information. The hotel's security chief was compromised. The diplomatic protection services might include additional conspirators. Even reaching out to her own handlers could expose the operation and cause the perpetrators to accelerate their timeline. Jessica made her way back to the employee areas, her mind working through options and scenarios. She had approximately 6 hours before Phase 2 implementation began, which presumably meant activation of the chemical weapon system. During that time, she needed to identify all the conspirators, neutralize the threat, and somehow do it without revealing her true capabilities. The challenge was complicated by her compromised cover. Thompson and his associates knew she wasn't who she claimed to be, making her movements subject to intense scrutiny. Any deviation from normal housekeeping behavior would trigger immediate investigation. As she reached the employee locker room to retrieve her personal belongings, Jessica discovered one more disturbing detail. Her locker had been searched. The contents were carefully arranged to appear undisturbed, but her trained eye immediately noticed subtle differences in positioning and orientation. They'd found her detailed maps of the hotel, her handwritten notes about security patterns, and most dangerously, the encrypted communication device hiding behind a false panel. The device was still there, but microscopic examination revealed evidence of tampering. Jessica now faced the terrifying possibility that her own communications had been compromised, her handlers identified, and her entire support network exposed. She was completely alone in a hostile environment, racing against time to prevent an international catastrophe that could reshape global politics forever. The invisible hotel maid was about to become the world's last line of defense against an attack that no one else even knew was coming. But first, she had to survive until morning. Jessica returned to her small apartment at 2:17 a.m., knowing it might be the last time she'd see the modest space she'd called home for 3 months. The one-bedroom unit in a converted warehouse had served its purpose perfectly, close enough to the hotel for a believable commute, anonymous enough to avoid attention, and strategically positioned with multiple escape routes she'd memorized on her first day. Now, as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the dim city lights filtering through industrial windows, Jessica faced the most critical decision of her career. Every protocol demanded she contact her handlers immediately, but the compromised communication device made that impossibly dangerous. If Thompson's people were monitoring her channels, reaching out for backup could trigger immediate retaliation against her support network. She opened the hidden compartment beneath her closet floor, revealing the emergency kit she'd hoped never to use. Inside were items that had nothing to do with housekeeping and everything to do with her real profession. Ceramic knife components designed to evade metal detectors, lock-picking tools disguised as hair accessories, military-grade first aid supplies, and most importantly, a backup identity complete with documents, credit cards, and extraction protocols. But Jessica wasn't planning to run. Too many innocent lives hung in the balance. She spread detailed architectural drawings of the Grand Meridian across her kitchen table, blueprints she'd obtained through classified channels during her initial mission briefing. The chemical dispersal system she'd discovered was positioned to maximize distribution through the building's air circulation network, but every system had vulnerabilities. The ventilation network drew air through 3 primary intake points on the building's roof. If she could disable the main circulation pumps before 6 a.m., the chemical weapon would be unable to spread beyond the immediate dispersal location. The challenge was reaching the mechanical equipment without triggering the hotel's enhanced security protocols. Jessica's special operations background included extensive training in urban infiltration, but this situation required more than technical skills. She needed to anticipate how Thompson and his conspirators would react once they realized their operation was under threat. At 3:45 a.m., her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown sender. Package confirmed operational. Timeline accelerated to 0500 hours. Eliminate all witnesses. The message wasn't intended for her. It was evidence that Thompson's team had intercepted communications meant for other conspirators. More critically, they'd moved up their timeline by 1 hour, giving Jessica significantly less time to prevent the attack. She began preparing with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 12 years of covert operations. Black tactical clothing to minimize visibility against the pre-dawn darkness. Soft-soled boots for silent movement across various surfaces. Equipment secured in locations that wouldn't interfere with combat mobility. The ceramic knife components assembled into a weapon that looked nothing like traditional military hardware, but could be just as lethal in trained hands. Jessica tested the balance and grip, muscle memory from countless training sessions taking over despite months of playing the helpless hotel maid. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the transformation clearly. Gone was the submissive posture and uncertain expression she'd perfected for her cover identity. The woman staring back had the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. Jessica arrived at the Grand Meridian at 4:33 a.m. through the service entrance she'd used for 3 months, but this time she was carrying significantly more than cleaning supplies. The building's overnight security was lighter than daytime protocols, but Thompson had positioned additional personnel in strategic locations that suggested he knew exactly what kind of threat he was facing. She avoided the main service corridors and employee areas, instead using maintenance shafts and utility spaces to reach the upper floors. The building's original 1920s construction included numerous architectural features that modern security systems couldn't effectively monitor. Narrow passages between walls, abandoned elevator shafts, and service tunnels that connected mechanical rooms across multiple floors. Moving through these spaces required physical conditioning that no legitimate housekeeper would possess, but Jessica navigated them with practiced efficiency. Years of similar infiltration missions had taught her to read building layouts like maps, identifying structural weaknesses and hidden pathways that architects never intended for human passage. At 4:52 a.m., she reached the 32nd floor mechanical room that housed primary ventilation controls for the upper diplomatic floors. The space hummed with the constant noise of air circulation equipment, providing acoustic cover for the work she needed to accomplish. The main circulation pumps were massive industrial units, each one responsible for moving thousands of cubic feet of air per minute throughout the building. Jessica located the primary electrical feeds and began installing bypass circuits that would allow her to shut down the system remotely when the chemical attack began. The work required precise technical knowledge of electrical systems and mechanical engineering, skills that had nothing to do with housekeeping, but everything to prevent the dispersal of airborne toxins. She was connecting the final bypass circuit when footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Jessica immediately killed her work light and pressed herself behind one of the larger pump units, listening as multiple people approached the mechanical room. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, and she could hear hushed conversation about final system checks and confirming operational status. The door opened and 2 figures entered with powerful flashlights. Jessica recognized Thompson's voice immediately, but the second person was someone she'd never encountered, a woman with a slight European accent who seemed to be directing the technical aspects of the operation. The dispersal mechanism tested successfully during the overnight trial, the woman said, consulting what appeared to be a tablet computer. Chemical concentration should achieve lethal saturation within 12 minutes of activation. Thompson played his flashlight beam across the ventilation equipment. What about the Miller situation? She's definitely not who she claims to be. The woman's response chilled Jessica to her core. Asset termination is scheduled for 0500 hours, simultaneously with Phase 2 activation. Her body will be discovered with the other casualties, eliminating any potential investigation complications. Jessica realized they weren't just planning to prevent her from interfering with the chemical attack, they intended to murder her at the exact moment the weapon activated. The timing suggested they knew her approximate location and had prepared specific countermeasures. The two conspirators spent 15 minutes conducting their system check before leaving the mechanical room. Jessica waited until their footsteps faded completely before emerging from hiding, but now she understood the true scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just a terrorist attack. It was a carefully orchestrated operation involving multiple foreign intelligence services, hotel security staff, and resources that suggested state-level planning. The economic summit was providing cover for something that could destabilize global financial markets and eliminate key diplomatic figures simultaneously. More immediately dangerous, Thompson's team knew she was in the building and had positioned themselves to eliminate her at 5 a.m., exactly 13 minutes away. Jessica completed her sabotage of the ventilation system, then began moving toward the building's central core where the chemical dispersal device was hidden. She had less than 15 minutes to disable the weapon, evade multiple assassination teams, and somehow alert authorities about a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything she'd initially imagined. The hotel maid who had spent months being invisible was about to become the most hunted person in Chicago. But for the first time since arriving at the Grand Meridian, Jessica Miller was done pretending to be helpless. The real fight was about to begin. At exactly 4:58 a.m., Jessica's world exploded into chaos when the first assassination team struck without warning. She was descending through a maintenance shaft toward the sub-basement chemical weapon location when the building's fire suppression system suddenly activated throughout the mechanical floors. Torrents of water cascaded through the utility spaces, turning metal surfaces slippery and creating a thunderous noise that would mask gunfire. The timing wasn't coincidental. Thompson's people were using the suppression system as cover for their assault, while simultaneously making Jessica's movement through confined spaces exponentially more dangerous. She dropped silently into the sub-basement corridor, water streaming from her tactical clothing, and immediately spotted the ambush. 3 armed figures in dark tactical gear had positioned themselves at strategic choke points, expecting her to emerge from the main service elevator or primary stairwell. Their positioning revealed military training and intimate knowledge of the hotel's layout. What they hadn't anticipated was Jessica's unconventional route through building infrastructure. The first operative was stationed near the electrical room entrance, carrying what appeared to be a suppressed submachine gun. Jessica observed him through the gap beneath a steam pipe, noting his body armor configuration, weapon readiness, and most importantly, his field of vision blind spots. She moved like liquid shadow along the corridor wall, using the mechanical noise and cascading water to mask her approach. Years of close-quarters combat training had taught her that even the most prepared adversaries had predictable behavioral patterns when holding static defensive positions. The takedown was swift and silent. Jessica emerged from his peripheral vision, applied a precise chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain within seconds, then guided his unconscious body to the floor without making a sound. His weapon and communication device disappeared with her into the shadows. The second operative was positioned with better sightlines but worse situational awareness. He was focused on monitoring the main corridor intersection, trusting his partner to cover the electrical room approach. That trust proved fatal when Jessica appeared behind him with his partner's suppressed weapon. The shot was perfectly placed, instant incapacitation without the noise signature that would alert the third team member.
Jessica caught the falling body and weapon, then used the unconscious operative's radio to monitor team communications. "Team Alpha, status report," Thompson's voice crackled through the earpiece. Jessica waited. Protocol demanded regular check-ins, but the timing would tell her how much operational freedom I had before the missing team members were discovered. "Team Alpha, respond immediately," Thompson repeated with growing urgency. The third operative broke radio silence. "Alpha 6 to control. No visual contact with Alpha 1 or Alpha 2. Possible compromise of Sector 3. Jessica was already moving. She had perhaps 90 seconds before additional teams converged on her location, and the chemical weapon dispersal system remained operational. Her sabotage of the ventilation controls would limit the attack's scope, but hundreds of people would still die if she couldn't disable the source device. The chemical dispersal unit was exactly where she discovered it earlier, integrated into the main air handling system with professional precision. Up close, Jessica could identify the specific components: military-grade nerve agent canister, electronically controlled release mechanism, and a timer system that showed 00247 remaining. Less than 3 minutes until activation. The device was sophisticated enough to include anti-tampering measures, but Jessica's technical training covered exactly these scenarios. She began disabling the trigger mechanism using tools from her emergency kit, working with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing failure meant mass casualties. At 00123 remaining, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, multiple people moving with tactical precision. Thompson's voice was clearly audible, giving instructions about containment and elimination protocols. Jessica made a critical decision. Rather than attempting to complete the disarm procedure, she physically removed the nerve agent canister from the dispersal mechanism and secured it in a containment bag designed for hazardous materials transport. The device could still activate, but it would only release harmless compressed air instead of lethal chemicals. She was sealing the door burst open, and Thompson appeared with 4 armed operatives in full tactical gear. Their weapons were raised and ready, but they hesitated for a crucial moment when they saw the small woman in housekeeping clothing crouched beside sophisticated chemical weapons equipment.
"Jessica Miller," Thompson said with grim satisfaction. "Or should I call you by your real name, Agent Sarah Morrison?" Jessica's blood ran cold. They knew her actual identity, which meant her entire operational history had been compromised. But more importantly, it meant this conspiracy reached much deeper into intelligence networks than she'd imagined. "The game's over," Thompson continued, gesturing for his team to maintain firing positions. "You've caused considerable complications, but the primary objective remains achievable through alternate methods." Jessica remained motionless, calculating angles, distances, and reaction times. 5 armed operatives in a confined space with limited cover options. Normally impossible odds, but her training had covered scenarios where survival depended on creating chaos rather than seeking tactical advantage. "How long have you known?" she asked, buying time while assessing equipment placement and structural vulnerabilities. Thompson smiled coldly. "We identified you during week 2. Military bearing, advanced technical skills, observation patterns consistent with intelligence training. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" The truth was more complex. Jessica had deliberately allowed certain behavioral patterns to show through because completely suppressing her real capabilities would have made the housekeeping cover unsustainable. The challenge had been finding the right balance between competence and invisibility. "The question," Thompson continued, "is who sent you and what they know about this operation." Jessica's response was to trigger the building's emergency lighting system by shooting out the primary electrical junction with the suppressed weapon she'd taken from the first operative. The sub-basement plunged into darkness, broken only by dim red emergency illumination, creating exactly the chaos she needed. The tactical team's advantage evaporated immediately. Their night vision equipment wasn't designed for the specific light spectrum of emergency systems, and their coordination depended on clear communication and sightlines that no longer existed. Jessica used her intimate knowledge of the mechanical room layout to move through spaces her adversaries couldn't navigate effectively. She disabled 2 more operatives using close-quarters combat techniques, then used their positions to create crossfire confusion that turned the remaining team members against each other in the darkness. When the emergency lighting stabilized 30 seconds later, Jessica had disappeared with the chemical weapon canister, leaving Thompson alone with 3 unconscious team members and the growing realization that he'd seriously underestimated his opponent. But the operation was far from over. Jessica's radio intercepts revealed that multiple backup teams were converging on the hotel. The diplomatic security details were preparing for emergency evacuation, and most critically, Thompson was activating what he called Protocol 7, a contingency plan that would achieve the mission objectives through different means. Jessica emerged from the sub-basement into a building transformed by crisis. Emergency alarms were blaring throughout all floors, security teams were sealing off sections of the hotel, and she could hear helicopters approaching from multiple directions. The quiet hotel maid who had been invisible for 3 months was now the most wanted person in a building filled with people who wanted her dead. But she still had the chemical weapon canister, and she was beginning to understand that stopping Thompson's immediate attack was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Jessica reached the main floor to discover that the Grand Meridian had transformed into a war zone. Through the service corridor windows, she could see black SUVs and unmarked vans surrounding the building, while helicopters circled overhead with searchlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. What should have been a covert operation had escalated into a full-scale siege. But something was wrong with the response. The vehicles and aircraft bore no official markings, and the personnel she glimpsed through windows weren't wearing standard law enforcement or military uniforms. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was Thompson's backup plan being implemented with terrifying efficiency. Jessica pressed herself against the wall as footsteps thundered past in the main corridor. Through a crack in the service door, she watched hotel guests being herded toward the lobby by armed men in tactical gear. The guests weren't being evacuated. They were being gathered in one central location for reasons that made her stomach turn cold. Among the hostages, she recognized faces from the Economic Summit. Federal Reserve Chairman Robert Hayes, European Central Bank President Elena Vasquez, and at least 6 other high-ranking financial officials whose simultaneous disappearance would send global markets into freefall. Jessica's radio intercept equipment crackled with coordinated communications between multiple teams. Lobby secured. Package 2 is in position, awaiting final authorization for Protocol 7 implementation. She moved closer to the lobby service entrance and peered through the reinforced glass doors. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about Thompson's contingency plan. The entire lobby had been rigged with explosives. Professional demolition charges were positioned at structural support points, and she could see the distinctive configuration of a shaped charge system designed to bring down the building's central core. The chemical weapon attack had been Plan A. Protocol 7 was complete destruction of the hotel with all occupants inside. But this wasn't random terrorism. The explosive placement was too precise, too expertly calculated. Someone wanted it to look like a catastrophic structural failure rather than international conspiracy. Insurance investigators and structural engineers would find evidence of building code violations, maintenance failures, or construction defects rather than international conspiracy. Thompson appeared in the lobby center, no longer dressed as hotel security, but wearing military-style tactical gear with communication equipment that suggested command authority. He was coordinating with teams throughout the building through a sophisticated radio system that operated on encrypted frequencies. Phase 4 complete, Thompson reported to an unseen superior.
All primary targets are secured in the designated area. Structural charges are armed and ready. Estimated casualty count confirms mission parameters.
Jessica realized the true scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about eliminating specific diplomatic targets. It was about creating an international incident that would destabilize global financial systems while destroying all evidence of the conspiracy. The economic summit participants would die in what appeared to be a tragic hotel collapse, triggering market chaos that would benefit whoever had orchestrated this elaborate deception. She needed to get closer to understand the explosive system's configuration and find a way to neutralize it before the building came down. The service corridors provided access to the lobby's perimeter, but Thompson's people had positioned guards at every entrance she'd previously mapped. Jessica chose the most dangerous route, through the main kitchen area that connected directly to the lobby's service stations. The kitchen staff had been evacuated hours earlier, leaving behind industrial equipment and preparation areas that could provide cover, but also presented numerous tactical disadvantages. Moving through the darkened kitchen, she encountered her first major obstacle. Two guards positioned near the pastry station with clear sightlines to multiple entry points. Both were armed with automatic weapons and wearing body armor that would require precise shot placement to defeat. Jessica used the kitchen's industrial equipment to create a distraction, triggering the automated bread oven's alarm system while simultaneously activating several commercial mixers. The cacophony of mechanical noise drew both guards toward the equipment area, allowing her to approach from their flanks. The engagement was swift and decisive. Jessica disabled the first guard with a carotid restraint that rendered him unconscious within seconds, then used his weapon to neutralize the second before he could raise an alarm. Their communication devices revealed the building's complete tactical layout and confirmed her worst suspicions about Protocol 7's timeline. Detonation sequence initiates in T-8 minutes, a voice reported through the radio. All teams clear the blast radius and prepare for extraction. Jessica had 8 minutes to disable a sophisticated explosive system designed by professionals who'd had weeks to plan and position their charges. Under normal circumstances, it would be impossible. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Jessica wasn't a normal opponent. She accessed the lobby through the catering service entrance, emerging behind the main reception desk where she had a clear view of the explosive setup. The charges were connected through a central control unit positioned near Thompson's command post, but the system included multiple redundancies and backup detonators that would require simultaneous neutralization. Thompson was still coordinating the operation, unaware that Jessica had penetrated his security perimeter. "Confirm all teams are clear of the structure," he ordered. "Final countdown begins on my mark." Jessica realized she had one advantage that Thompson couldn't anticipate: her detailed knowledge of the hotel's original 1920s construction. The building's architects had included features that modern blueprints didn't show: hidden passages, reinforced sections, and structural redundancies that could limit explosive damage if she could redirect the blast forces. But first, she needed to reach the central detonation control without alerting Thompson's remaining security team. The lobby was brightly lit and provided minimal cover, while armed guards maintained overlapping fields of fire from multiple elevated positions. Jessica's solution was audacious and completely unexpected. Instead of attempting stealth, she triggered the building's fire alarm system while simultaneously activating every emergency protocol she could access through the hotel's computerized systems. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Thompson's carefully organized operation devolved into confusion as his team struggled to maintain coordination while emergency systems created sensory overload throughout the building. Jessica used the distraction to reach the explosive control unit, but discovered that disabling it would require more time than she had available. The device was protected by military-grade encryption and tamper-resistant housing designed to prevent exactly what she was attempting. With T-minus 4 minutes remaining, she made a desperate decision that would either save hundreds of lives or get her killed in the process. Instead of trying to disable the explosives, she began reprogramming the detonation sequence to redirect the blast forces away from the building's occupied areas. Her plan was to turn Thompson's own weapon against him by channeling the explosive power through the hotel's service areas and mechanical spaces, where it would cause structural damage without total collapse. Thompson spotted her at T-minus 2 minutes. "Kill her now," he screamed over the alarm noise. Multiple weapons opened fire simultaneously, but Jessica was no longer the invisible hotel maid who had spent months avoiding confrontation. She moved through the explosive-laden lobby like a force of nature, using her complete knowledge of the space to stay ahead of gunfire while completing the most critical reprogramming of her career. With 30 seconds remaining, Thompson raised his own weapon and aimed directly at Jessica's position behind the detonation control unit. "You can't stop this," he snarled. "Even if you survive the explosion, the investigation will never trace back to us. You'll die knowing you failed to prevent an international catastrophe." Jessica looked up from the control unit with the satisfied expression of someone who had just accomplished the impossible. "You're right about one thing," she replied calmly. "This is going to be an international catastrophe, but not the one you planned." The explosions began at exactly 5 a.m., but they weren't the devastating structural collapse Thompson had orchestrated. Instead, they were Jessica's carefully redirected blasts that brought down only the building's service areas while leaving the main structure intact. Thompson's expression of triumph transformed into horror as he realized what had happened. But his realization came exactly 1 second too late. The explosions tore through the Grand Meridian service levels like thunder rolling through underground caverns, but instead of bringing down the entire structure, they created precisely what Jessica had calculated: controlled demolition of the building's non-essential areas, while preserving the main lobby and guest floors where hundreds of innocent people waited in terror. Thompson's face went white as he watched his carefully orchestrated catastrophe transform into something entirely different. The shaped charges he'd positioned to bring down structural supports were now channeling their destructive force through utility tunnels and mechanical spaces, creating spectacular destruction that looked devastating but left the building's core intact. "What did you do?" Thompson screamed over the thunderous noise of cascading debris. Jessica stood calmly beside the detonation control unit, her gray housekeeping uniform torn and stained, but her expression reflecting the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just prevented mass murder. "I gave you exactly what you wanted," she replied. "A spectacular explosion that will make international headlines and trigger the investigation you were trying to avoid." The truth of her strategy became clear as dust settled and emergency responders began flooding into the building. Thompson had planned for his teams to disappear in the chaos of a total structural collapse, leaving behind evidence that would point to building maintenance failures rather than deliberate sabotage. But Jessica's redirection of the explosive forces had preserved all the evidence while trapping Thompson's people inside a damaged but still standing structure. More critically, every communication device, every piece of sophisticated equipment, and every conspirator who had participated in Protocol 7 was now secured within a crime scene that would be analyzed by federal investigators for months. Thompson reached for his sidearm, but Jessica was already moving. Her months of careful observation had taught her to read the micro-expressions and body language that preceded violent action. She closed the distance between them before his weapon cleared its holster, applied a precise wrist lock that sent his gun skittering across the marble floor, then used his own momentum to slam him face first into the reception desk. "Marcus Thompson," she said in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Former police detective, currently under arrest for international terrorism, conspiracy to commit mass murder, and treason against the United States." Thompson struggled against her grip, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You have no authority here. You're just some rogue agent who's going to disappear into a black site prison where nobody will ever find you." Jessica's response was to produce credentials that made Thompson's eyes go wide with shock. Not the fabricated documents of Jessica Miller, the hotel maid, but the real identification of Special Agent Sarah Morrison, Department of Justice, Counter-Terrorism Division. "Actually," she said calmly, "I have all the authority I need, and unlike you, I've been recording everything." The sophisticated recording equipment she'd carried throughout the operation had captured every conversation, every admission of guilt, and every detail of the international conspiracy. Thompson's own words would provide prosecutors with enough evidence to dismantle the entire network of conspirators. As FBI tactical teams flooded into the lobby, Jessica finally allowed herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what she'd prevented. The economic summit participants who had been hostage were shaken but unharmed. The chemical weapon canister remained secured in its containment unit. The building's structural integrity had been preserved despite the explosions. Most importantly, the investigation that Thompson had tried to prevent was now inevitable. His conspiracy had involved foreign intelligence services, corrupt hotel officials, and resources that suggested state-level planning. The evidence Jessica had gathered would expose networks of international criminals who had operated in shadows for years. But the immediate crisis wasn't over. Thompson's radio communications had referenced extraction teams and contingency protocols that suggested his organization had prepared for the possibility of operational failure. Even with Thompson in custody, Jessica knew that other conspirators were still active and potentially dangerous. She was coordinating with FBI team leaders when Agent Bradley approached, the same State Department security official who had interviewed her just days earlier. His expression showed a mixture of professional respect and personal embarrassment. "Agent Morrison," he said formally, "I owe you a significant apology. We had no idea you were operating under such deep cover." Jessica nodded acknowledgement but remained focused on operational priorities. "How much of Thompson's network have we identified?" Bradley consulted his tablet computer. "Your intelligence gathering identified 12 hotel employees with direct involvement, plus at least 6 foreign operatives who were coordinating the international aspects. We're tracking financial transfers that suggest this operation was funded by interests that wanted to destabilize global currency markets." The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than Jessica had imagined during her months of careful observation. The economic summit had been targeted not just for its diplomatic significance, but because the death of key financial officials would have triggered market chaos that would benefit specific investment positions and currency manipulations. "There's something else," Bradley continued, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The chemical weapon you secured wasn't just military-grade nerve agent. Laboratory analysis indicates it was specifically designed to leave forensic evidence suggesting it originated from a different country entirely. Someone wanted the attack to be blamed on a nation that had nothing to do with the conspiracy." Jessica felt a chill of realization. The plot hadn't just been about mass murder, it had been about manufacturing evidence for international conflict. If the attack had succeeded as planned, it would have provided justification for military action against an innocent nation, while the real perpetrators remained hidden.
As the morning progressed and investigators continued processing the crime scene, Jessica found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. For 3 months, she had been the invisible hotel maid, dismissed and underestimated by everyone around her. The very qualities that made her effective as an undercover operative, her attention to detail, her quiet observation, her methodical approach to problems, had been seen as signs of intellectual limitation rather than professional expertise. The irony wasn't lost on her that Thompson's greatest tactical error had been assuming that someone in a housekeeping uniform couldn't possibly pose a serious threat to his sophisticated operation. His prejudices and assumptions had blinded him to the reality that expertise and capability weren't always announced with fanfare. By noon, the Grand Meridian Hotel had been secured as a federal crime scene, and the international media was reporting on what they described as a foiled terrorist attack without understanding the true scope of what had been prevented.
Jessica's role would remain classified for security reasons, but the investigation she had made possible would continue for years. As she prepared to leave the building for the final time, Jessica walked through the lobby where she had spent countless hours observing the behavior of people who had never really seen her. The marble floors were cracked from the explosions, the crystal chandeliers were damaged, and debris covered surfaces that had once gleamed with luxury. But the building was still standing, and hundreds of people were still alive because someone who appeared powerless had refused to accept that appearance as reality. Agent Bradley approached her one final time as she reached the main entrance. "What's next for you, Agent Morrison?" Jessica looked back at the damaged but intact hotel, then at the federal agents and investigators who were continuing to unravel Thompson's conspiracy. "There are other hotels," she said quietly, "other conferences, other people who think they're invisible but might be the only thing standing between the innocent and those who would harm them." She walked out into the Chicago morning, leaving behind the identity of Jessica Miller, the hotel maid, forever. But the lessons she learned about the power of being underestimated would stay with her for the rest of her career. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody bothers to notice. And sometimes, that's exactly what the world needs. 6 months after the Grand Meridian incident, Jessica Morrison sat in a congressional hearing room facing a panel of senators who were still struggling to comprehend the full scope of what she had uncovered. The closed-door testimony was classified at the highest levels, but the investigation that followed her heroic actions had already resulted in the largest international conspiracy prosecution in decades. "Agent Morrison," Senator Patricia Williams began, consulting classified documents spread across the committee table, "your investigation revealed that this wasn't just a terrorist attack, but part of a coordinated effort to manipulate global financial markets. Can you help us understand the broader implications?" Jessica looked across the room at faces that reflected the same mixture of disbelief and respect she'd seen from Agent Bradley that morning at the hotel. These were powerful people who were accustomed to being the most knowledgeable individuals in any room, yet they were learning about threats they'd never imagined from someone whose greatest asset had been utterly unremarkable. "The Thompson network operated in 12 countries," Jessica replied, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had characterized her throughout the investigation. "They had infiltrated hotels, conference centers, and diplomatic facilities across 3 continents. The Grand Meridian was intended as a proof of concept for much larger operations." Senator Robert Chen leaned forward. "Are you saying there were other similar plots in development?" "We've identified at least 7 additional targets, including the World Economic Forum, the G7 Summit, and 2 major international banking conferences. The pattern was always the same: infiltrate service staff, position assets during major gatherings, then create catastrophic events that would appear to be either accidents or attacks by convenient scapegoat nations." The senators exchanged troubled glances. The investigation had already exposed corruption in multiple intelligence agencies, revealed foreign influence operations that reached into American financial institutions, and uncovered weapons trafficking networks that had operated undetected for years. But Jessica's most significant contribution hadn't been stopping a single attack. It had been demonstrating how invisible people could be strategically positioned throughout society's most critical infrastructure. Her success had prompted a complete reassessment of security protocols for diplomatic events, financial conferences, and international gatherings. "The psychological work you developed during your undercover assignment has been particularly valuable," Senator Williams noted. "You've essentially created a new framework for understanding how people in service positions can observe and report security vulnerabilities." Jessica nodded. During her months as a hotel maid, she documented not just the specific conspiracy she'd been sent to investigate, but the broader patterns of how powerful people interact with those they consider beneath their notice. The intelligence value of that research extended far beyond counterterrorism applications. "People in service positions see everything," she explained. "They're present during private conversations, they access secure areas, they observe behavioral patterns that reveal security vulnerabilities. But they're also systematically ignored by the people they're serving.
That invisibility can be either a vulnerability or an asset, depending on whose side they're on. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering technical aspects of the investigation that would influence policy decisions for decades. Jessica's detailed intelligence gathering had provided prosecutors with evidence to convict 47 individuals across multiple countries, including Thompson, who was now serving life in federal prison without possibility of parole.
More importantly, the network's financial backing had been traced to investment funds and currency manipulation schemes that reached into some of the world's largest financial institutions. The economic damage that would have resulted from successful attacks could have triggered global recession and destabilized governments throughout Europe and Asia. As Jessica left the congressional building that afternoon, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since stepping off that transport van into the scorching Chicago heat. The quiet hotel maid who had been invisible for 3 months had become one of the most decorated agents in counterterrorism history, though her public recognition would remain limited by the classified nature of her work. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her current supervisor. New assignment briefing scheduled for Monday, high-priority infiltration, deep cover requirements similar to Grand Meridian operation. Jessica smiled as she read the details. Another hotel, another international conference, another opportunity to be underestimated by people who would never imagine that their greatest threat might be someone whose job was to clean their rooms and make their beds. But the most significant change wasn't in Jessica's career trajectory. It was in how security services worldwide had begun to recognize and utilize the intelligence potential of people in invisible positions throughout society. The Grand Meridian operation had spawned training programs, recruitment initiatives, and operational frameworks that turned traditional assumptions about surveillance and infiltration completely upside down. A week later, Jessica found herself in the employee training room of the Palazzo Internazionale in Geneva, Switzerland. She was once again wearing a gray housekeeping uniform, carrying cleaning supplies, and adopting the posture and mannerisms of someone whose presence would be forgotten within minutes of any interaction. But this time, she wasn't alone. Throughout the training session, she identified at least 3 other women whose backgrounds clearly included military or intelligence experience despite their carefully constructed civilian personas. The invisible army was growing, and dangerous people around the world were about to discover that their assumptions about who posed a threat were dangerously outdated. A week later, Jessica found herself in the employee training room of the Palazzo Internazionale in Geneva, Switzerland. She was once again wearing a gray housekeeping uniform, carrying cleaning supplies, and adopting the posture and mannerisms of someone whose presence would be forgotten within minutes of any interaction. But this time, she wasn't alone. Throughout the training session, she identified at least 3 other women whose backgrounds clearly included military or intelligence experience despite their carefully constructed civilian personas. The invisible army was growing, and dangerous people around the world were about to discover that their assumptions about who posed a threat were dangerously outdated. The trainer, a middle-aged Swiss woman named Mrs. Hoffman, was explaining room cleaning procedures when her eyes met Jessica's with the briefest flicker of recognition. Not personal recognition, but the professional acknowledgement between operatives who understood that their most powerful weapon was society's tendency to overlook people in service positions. "Ladies," Mrs. Hoffman said as the training session concluded, "remember that attention to detail is everything in this profession. You never know what you might observe that could be important to someone who needs that information." The message was clear. The Grand Meridian operation had proven that the world's most critical intelligence gathering could be conducted by people who appeared to have no power, no authority, and no significance. But in reality, they were the ones who saw everything, heard everything, and remembered everything that the powerful preferred to ignore. As Jessica began her second deep cover assignment, she carried with her the knowledge that she was part of something much larger than individual heroism. She represented a fundamental shift in how intelligence operations could utilize society's invisible workforce to protect innocent people from threats they would never see coming.
The housekeeping cart she pushed down the Geneva Hotel's elegant corridors looked identical to hundreds of others throughout the world. But it was being guided by someone who had proven that the most dangerous person in any room might be the one nobody bothers to notice. And in a world where international conspiracies could unfold in luxury hotels while powerful people assumed they were completely secure, that invisibility had become humanity's most valuable defense against those who would do unspeakable harm in pursuit of money, power, and control. The quiet revolution had begun, and it was being led by people whose greatest strength was that no one expected them to be strong at all. Jessica Miller, the hotel maid, was gone forever. But the principles she had embodied, observation, patience, and the courage to act when action was needed, lived on in countless others who had learned that sometimes saving the world meant being willing to be invisible until the moment when visibility could change everything. The most important battles are often fought by people whose names will never appear in history books, but whose actions determine whether history continues to be written at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.